The man's screams cut through the humid air of the Brazilian rainforest like a blade. His name was Joe Silva, a rubber tapper who had been working the same grove for 12 years without incident. But on that September morning in 2019, his machete slipped, his hand plunged into a rotting log, and something inside responded with surgical precision. The lancehead viper's fangs sank deep into the flesh between his thumb and forefinger, pumping hemotoxic venom directly into his bloodstream. Within 90 seconds, his hand had swollen to twice its normal size. Within 5 minutes, blood began seeping from his gums, his eyes, even the pores of his skin. The venom was dissolving him from the inside out, turning his blood into something that could no longer clot, no longer carry oxygen, no longer sustain life. By the time his co-workers dragged him to the nearest clinica, 40-minute boat ride through serpentine tributaries, his arm had turned the color of spoiled meat, black and purple and green all at once, the tissue dying in real time. The doctors would later say he was lucky. They amputated at the elbow. Joe survived. But the venom of the world's worst snakes doesn't always offer that mercy. Some dissolve your blood, others paralyze your lungs. A few do both simultaneously, and those are the ones that give you just enough time to understand exactly what's killing you. If you're ready to descend into the venomous depths of what nature designed to kill you in the most excruciating ways possible, smash that like button and subscribe, because what's coming next will make you question every step you take in the wild. To understand the worst snake bites ever recorded, you first need to understand what venom actually does to a human body. This isn't poison you ingest. Venom is injected, delivered through hypodermic needle fangs that evolution spent millions of years perfecting into weapons more sophisticated than anything we've created in a laboratory. Snake venom is a cocktail of enzymes, proteins, and toxins that target specific biological systems with terrifying efficiency. Hemotoxins destroy blood cells and vessel walls, causing uncontrollable bleeding and tissue necrosis. Neurotoxins shut down nerve signals, paralyzing muscles including the ones that let you breathe. Cytotoxins liquefy cells themselves, turning solid flesh into a puddle of disintegrating tissue. The worst snakes don't just use one type, they combine them. They've weaponized chemistry itself, and when their fangs punch through your skin, you become the laboratory where that chemical warfare plays out in real time. Starting at number 10, we have the common death adder of Australia, and despite what its name suggests, there's nothing common about the agony it delivers. Acanthopus antarcticus hunts by ambush, burying itself in leaf litter with only its head exposed, waiting with the patience of a predator that knows its prey will eventually make a mistake. In 2016, a wildlife photographer named Marcus Chen was shooting macro photographs of insects in Queensland when he knelt directly onto one. The death adder's strike took less than 0.13 seconds. Chen described the initial bite as feeling like 2 hot needles. Nothing particularly dramatic, which is part of what makes this snake so dangerous. The venom is almost exclusively neurotoxic, and it works quietly. Within 20 minutes, Chen's eyelids began to droop. His speech slurred. He tried to stand and his legs wouldn't respond to the commands his brain was sending. The paralysis crept upward through his body like rising water, and he remained completely conscious as his respiratory muscles began to fail. He could think, he could see, he could feel terror, but he couldn't move, and soon he couldn't breathe. His camera crew performed CPR for 37 minutes until the helicopter arrived. Without antivenom, the death adder's bite has a 50% fatality rate, and even with treatment, victims often require mechanical ventilation for days as the neurotoxins slowly clear their system. At number 9 sits the Mojave Rattlesnake, Crotalus, which roams the deserts of the American Southwest and northern Mexico, carrying what herpetologists call the most toxic venom of any rattlesnake species in the Western Hemisphere. Most rattlesnakes rely heavily on hemotoxins, but the Mojave Rattlesnake's venom contains a neurotoxic component called Mojave toxin that attacks the nervous system while simultaneously destroying tissue. In 2008, a ranch hand in Arizona named Thomas Delgado was checking fence lines at dusk when he stepped over a rock and felt the strike on his calf. He killed the snake and drove himself to the hospital, a decision that nearly cost him his life because he didn't realize how quickly this particular venom works. By the time he reached the emergency room 40 minutes later, he was struggling to swallow. His vision had doubled. The puncture wounds on his calf had swollen grotesquely and turned dark purple. But more terrifying was the systemic shutdown happening throughout his body. The neurotoxins were blocking the signals between his nerves and muscles. He received 18 vials of antivenom over 6 hours, but the tissue damage to his leg was so severe that doctors debated amputation. They managed to save the limb, but Delgado spent 4 months in physical therapy relearning how to walk, and the muscle tissue in his calf never fully regenerated. The Mojave Rattlesnake's venom creates a double assault, attacking both your blood and your brain, giving you the worst of both worlds. Number 8 brings us to the puff adder of sub-Saharan Africa. Bitis arietans responsible for more snakebite fatalities on the African continent than any other species. This isn't because its venom is the most toxic, it isn't, but because of where it lives and how it hunts. The puff adder doesn't retreat when it hears footsteps. It freezes, relying on its camouflage, which means rural farmers and villagers step directly on them with horrifying regularity. Its fangs are the longest of any African viper, sometimes exceeding 1 full inch in length, and they deliver massive quantities of cytotoxic venom designed to predigest prey from the inside. In 2014, a 10-year-old boy in Zambia named Hepo Mwanza was walking to school when a puff adder struck his ankle. The venom load was enormous. Within an hour, his entire foot had swollen so severely that his skin split open in several places, weeping clear fluid mixed with blood. The cytotoxins were destroying cell membranes, causing massive localized tissue death. His father carried him 6 miles to the nearest clinic, but they had no antivenom. By the time they reached a hospital with proper supplies, 18 hours had passed. The doctors amputated below the knee, but even that wasn't enough to stop the infection that had taken root in the dead tissue. Chipo survived, barely, but the puff adder's venom had consumed his leg entirely, demonstrating the brutal efficiency of cytotoxic destruction that doesn't just kill, it erases. At number 7, we encounter the Boomslang dysphylatus tip, a rear-fanged snake from southern Africa whose venom was once underestimated with fatal consequences. Because its fangs are located toward the back of its mouth, it has to chew to inject venom, which led early researchers to believe it posed minimal danger to humans. They were catastrophically wrong. In 1957, renowned herpetologist Carl Schmidt was bitten by a juvenile boomslang while examining it in his laboratory. He documented his own symptoms in his journal, a decision that would provide science with a chilling first-hand account of hemotoxic envenomation and ultimately cost him his life. Schmidt wrote about nausea within hours. By the next morning, he was bleeding from his gums and experiencing severe abdominal pain. He refused medical treatment, believing the bite wasn't serious. 28 hours after the bite, he was dead. The boomslang's venom is a powerful anticoagulant that disables the blood's ability to clot. Victims bleed internally, massively, and often don't realize the extent of the damage until it's too late. Modern bite victims describe blood pouring from every orifice, their eyes turning completely red as blood vessels rupture, and a creeping coldness as their blood pressure drops catastrophically. The boomslang taught us that fang size doesn't determine lethality. Chemistry does, and its chemistry is designed to make you bleed until there's nothing left. But these 7 snakes, as horrifying as their venom may be, are merely the opening act. The mid-tier ranks waiting ahead deliver combinations of pain and destruction that push the absolute limits of what the human body can endure before it simply shuts down. And those stories, those survivors and those who weren't quite as fortunate, are where this descent into venom truly begins. At number 6, we meet the Gaboon Viper Bitis gabonica, a snake that holds multiple terrifying records simultaneously. It possesses the longest fangs of any venomous snake on Earth, measuring up to 2 inches in length, long enough to pierce through a boot and deep into the muscle beneath. It also delivers the highest venom yield per bite of any viper, capable of injecting up to 600 milligrams in a single strike, when the lethal dose for a human is estimated at just 100 milligrams. This snake is a living nightmare wrapped in beautiful geometric patterns that make it nearly invisible on the forest floor. In 2001, a zookeeper in Philadelphia named Robert Johnson was cleaning the Gaboon Viper enclosure when he made a fatal error in judgment, believing the snake was secured. It wasn't. The viper struck with explosive speed, both fangs sinking completely into Johnson's forearm, so deep they scraped against bone. He described the immediate sensation not as pain but as pressure, like someone had driven railroad spikes through his arm. Then came the fire. The venom load was catastrophic. Within minutes, his arm had swollen to nearly 3 times its normal diameter. The hemotoxic venom was destroying blood cells and vessel walls simultaneously, creating internal bleeding on a massive scale. His blood pressure dropped so rapidly he lost consciousness twice before reaching the hospital. Doctors administered 41 vials of antivenom over the course of 9 hours, a record amount at the time. Johnson survived, but the tissue damage was so extensive that he required 7 surgeries over 3 months to remove dead muscle and reconstruct what remained. The Gaboon Viper doesn't just bite. It injects enough venom to kill 5 adult humans, and when all that biological warfare floods into a single body, the results are nothing short of catastrophic. Number 5 takes us to the coastal waters and mangrove swamps of South and Southeast Asia, where the beaked sea snake, Hydrophis, patrols with venom that is drop for drop more toxic than any terrestrial snake. Sea snakes evolved from land-dwelling ancestors, returning to the ocean and developing venom so potent they needed only tiny amounts to paralyze fish instantly. That same venom, when delivered to a human, creates a medical emergency that unfolds in terrible slow motion. In 2012, a fisherman off the coast of Vietnam named Nguyen Van Than pulled in his nets and felt something writhe against his hand. The beaked sea snake bit him twice on the palm before he could throw it back into the water. Sea snake bites are often described as painless, and Than felt nothing dramatic, just 2 small puncture wounds. He continued working. This was his first mistake. The neurotoxic venom of the beaked sea snake contains powerful myotoxins that destroy muscle tissue while simultaneously shutting down nerve function. Fan didn't seek medical attention until 4 hours later when his hand began to ache with a deep, sickening throb. By hour 6, his entire arm was stiff. By hour 8, he couldn't lift his head from the pillow. The paralysis was spreading through his body, and worse, his urine had turned the color of dark tie, a sign that his muscle tissue was dissolving, releasing myoglobin into his bloodstream that was now poisoning his kidneys. He spent 2 weeks on a ventilator as the neurotoxins slowly metabolized. His kidneys failed completely and required dialysis for 3 months before function partially returned. The beaked sea snake's venom doesn't announce itself with dramatic swelling or immediate agony. It simply begins erasing your ability to move, to breathe, to filter waste from your blood. And by the time you realize what's happening, the venom has already burrowed deep into every system that keeps you alive. At number 4, we encounter the eastern brown snake of Australia, Pseudonea textilis, which holds the disturbing distinction of causing more snakebite deaths in Australia than any other species despite the widespread availability of This isn't because Australians lack medical infrastructure, it's because the eastern brown snake is fast, aggressive when cornered, and its venom is a sophisticated cocktail of neurotoxins and coagulants that attack multiple systems simultaneously. In 2006, a construction worker in Queensland named David Walsh was clearing brush when an eastern brown snake struck his boot. The fangs didn't penetrate. Walsh, believing himself safe, kicked the snake away. It struck again, this time hitting his ankle above the boot line. He killed the snake with his shovel and called his supervisor, saying he'd been bitten but felt fine. This would be a fatal miscalculation. Eastern brown snake venom contains powerful procoagulants that cause your blood to clot uncontrollably inside your vessels, consuming all your clotting factors in the process. Within 30 minutes, Walsh collapsed. His blood had begun clotting throughout his circulatory system, forming tiny clots in his brain, lungs, and kidneys. But once all the clotting factors were exhausted, his blood could no longer clot at all. He began bleeding from his nose, his gums, even from old scars. He was hemorrhaging internally while simultaneously throwing clots. By the time the ambulance reached the remote construction site, Walsh was unconscious and suffering from a massive stroke caused by clots in his brain. He died before reaching the hospital. The eastern brown snake's venom creates a biological paradox, clotting and bleeding simultaneously, and the human body simply cannot survive the contradiction. Number 3 brings us face to face with the Inland Taipan, Oxyranus microlipidotus, known throughout Australia as the fierce snake, though its name refers not to its temperament but to the absolutely savage potency of its venom. This snake possesses the most toxic venom of any land snake on Earth. A single bite contains enough venom to kill 100 adult humans or 250,000 mice. The venom is a hellish mixture of neurotoxins, hemotoxins, and myotoxins working in perfect terrible synchrony. Incredibly, there are no recorded human fatalities from the Inland Taipan, but this is purely because it inhabits some of the most remote desert regions of Central Australia where human contact is extraordinarily rare. However, laboratory analysis and the few documented bites that have occurred under controlled conditions paint an absolutely terrifying picture. In 1976, a herpetologist named Dr. Brian Fry was working with an Inland Taipan specimen when it managed to inject a tiny amount of venom through his glove. Not a full defensive bite, just a fraction of what the snake is capable of delivering. Even that minuscule dose caused immediate systemic symptoms. Within minutes, Fry experienced severe headache, nausea, and vomiting. His blood pressure spiked and then plummeted. Laboratory tests showed his blood was already breaking down, clotting factors diminishing rapidly. He received antivenom within 30 minutes and still spent 2 days in intensive care as the venom worked through his system. Medical researchers who've studied the Inland Taipan's venom describe it as almost perfectly engineered for rapid killing. The neurotoxins paralyze, the hemotoxins destroy blood cells and vessels, and the myotoxins dissolve muscle tissue including heart muscle. A full envenomation would likely cause death within 45 minutes without immediate medical intervention. And even with antivenom, the cascade of damage might be impossible to reverse. This is a snake whose venom is so excessive, so overwhelmingly powerful, that it seems designed not just to kill but to kill with absolute certainty. No matter how large or resilient the prey, these mid-tier nightmares demonstrate that venom potency doesn't always correlate with death toll. The Gaboon Viper's massive fang length and venom volume, the Beaked Sea Snake's delayed but devastating attack on muscles and kidneys, the Eastern Brown's paradoxical clotting catastrophe, and the Inland Taipan's laboratory perfect killing cocktail each represents a different evolutionary strategy for ending life as efficiently as possible. But they are not the worst. The top 2 positions are reserved for snakes whose bites have created legends of agony, whose venom has been described by survivors as pain beyond anything the human nervous system was designed to process, and whose names alone cause experienced field researchers to proceed with a level of caution that borders on paranoia. Those encounters, those screams in hospital wards, those amputations, and those bodies that couldn't be saved despite every medical intervention available, those stories are waiting just ahead in the shadows, where the worst of evolution's chemical weapons have been perfected into instruments of pure biological horror. At number 3, we face the Russell's Viper, Deadliest, a snake responsible for tens of thousands of deaths across South Asia, making it one of the true mass killers of the snake world. This isn't a rare serpent lurking in untouched wilderness. The Russell's Viper thrives in agricultural areas, rice paddies, and village outskirts where human and snake territories overlap with deadly frequency. Its venom is a trifecta of hemotoxic, neurotoxic, and coagulation-disrupting compounds that attack the body from multiple angles simultaneously. And the pain survivors describe the pain as something that rewrites your understanding of what agony actually means. In 2017, a farmer in Sri Lanka named Sumith Bandara was harvesting rice at dawn when he stepped on a Russell's Viper hidden in the stubble. The snake struck 3 times in rapid succession, injecting a massive venom load into his calf and ankle. Bandara said the initial bite felt like someone had plunged a white-hot iron into his leg. Within 5 minutes, the pain had intensified to the point where he was screaming uncontrollably. His legs swelled so rapidly that his skin became shiny and tight, stretched to the point of splitting. But the external symptoms were nothing compared to what was happening inside. The venom was triggering massive hemolysis, destruction of red blood cells, on a scale that turned his blood into a toxic soup. His kidneys began filtering the debris and almost immediately started to fail. Blood seeped through the walls of his capillaries, pooling under his skin in enormous bruises that spread across his torso. He vomited blood. His eyes hemorrhaged, turning the whites completely red. At the hospital, doctors struggled to maintain his blood pressure as his vascular system essentially collapsed. He required 43 vials of anti-venom and emergency dialysis. They saved his life, but his kidneys never fully recovered. Russell's Viper venom doesn't just kill, it dismantles your body's most critical systems one by one, while keeping you conscious enough to experience every moment of the destruction. The pain is so severe that victims often go into shock not from blood loss but from the overwhelming sensory input of every pain receptor in the affected limb firing simultaneously without pause. Number 2 takes us into the jungles and plantations of Central and South America, where the Fertilans Bothrops aspert has earned a reputation as perhaps the most medically significant snake in the Americas. It's large, aggressive when surprised, possesses long fangs and a high venom yield, and it lives in close proximity to human populations. The Fertilans accounts for more snakebite deaths in its range than all other species combined, and the survivors carry scars, both physical and psychological, that never fully fade. The venom is intensely hemotoxic and proteolytic, meaning it doesn't just destroy blood cells, it liquefies tissue on a cellular level. In 2015, a plantation worker in Costa Rica named Carlos Mendoza was cutting through dense vegetation with a machete when a Fertilan struck his thigh. The fangs sank deep, delivering what later tests would estimate as nearly 200 milligrams of venom. Mendoza described the pain as instant and absolute, like someone had injected lava directly into his femoral artery. Within 10 minutes, his entire leg from hip to toes had swollen to almost twice its normal size. The skin turned mottled purple and black. But what happened next represents the true horror of Fertilans envenomation. The proteolytic enzymes in the venom began breaking down the connective tissue, the muscle fibers, even the walls of blood vessels. His leg wasn't just swelling, it was digesting itself from within. Clear fluid mixed with blood began weeping through his pores. The smell of necrotic tissue filled the air within an hour. At the hospital, doctors faced an impossible situation. The tissue death was spreading faster than they could track it. They performed an emergency fasciotomy, cutting long incisions down his leg to relieve the pressure and allow the destroyed tissue to drain. What came out wasn't blood, it was a thick, dark mixture of liquefied muscle, fat, and cellular debris. Mendoza underwent 7 surgeries over 2 weeks. Surgeons removed nearly 40% of the muscle mass in his thigh, carving away everything that had been touched by the venom's destructive enzymes. The pain during recovery was described by his doctors as among the worst they'd ever witnessed, requiring continuous epidural anesthesia for 10 days, because standard pain medications couldn't touch the nerve damage caused by the venom. Mendoza survived, but his leg is a patchwork of scar tissue and skin grafts, permanently weakened, monument to what happens when one of nature's most efficient tissue-destroying venoms meets human flesh. The Fertilans doesn't just bite, it consumes you, breaking down your body into its component parts while you're still using it, still depending on it, still trapped inside it. And now we arrive at number 1. The worst snakebite ever recorded, the most agonizing, most destructive, most absolutely devastating envenomation known to medical science. This position belongs to the saw-scaled viper, genus Echis, a group of small snakes found across Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent that cause more human deaths than any other snake group on Earth. These vipers are small, rarely exceeding 2 feet in length, but their venom is catastrophically potent and they are extraordinarily aggressive. Unlike many snakes that attempt to flee from humans, saw-scaled vipers hold their ground, coil into a distinctive C-shape, and produce a warning sound by rubbing their serrated scales together, a sound like water sizzling on a hot pan. But most victims never hear the warning. The snake strikes from the darkness, from under a rock, from the sand it has buried itself in, and once those fangs sink in, you are fighting for your life against one of evolution's most perfected killing tools. The venom contains a massive array of hemotoxins, cytotoxins, and anticoagulants that create a synergistic effect far worse than the sum of its parts. In 2018, a doctor working with Doctors Without Borders documented a case in rural India that represents perhaps the most extreme saw-scaled viper envenomation ever recorded. A 13-year-old girl named Priya was sleeping on the floor of her family's home when a saw-scaled viper crawled across her and, startled when she moved in her sleep, bit her on the face, specifically on the soft tissue near her left eye. She woke screaming. Her parents lit a lamp and saw blood pouring from the bite wound. But worse, saw the snake still there, coiled on their daughter's pillow. They killed it and rushed her to a clinic, but in rural India, antivenom access is limited and often delayed by hours or even days. By the time they reached a facility with proper supplies, 4 hours had passed. The venom had done catastrophic damage. Her entire face had swollen grotesquely, her eye socket filled with blood, and the tissue around the bite had turned black. The anticoagulant properties of the venom meant blood was pouring from the puncture wounds without clotting, but she was also bleeding internally throughout her head and neck. Her gums bled. Her nose bled. Blood filled her mouth faster than she could spit it out. The cytotoxins were causing massive localized tissue death on her face. Doctors administered every vial of antivenom available, 19 vials, but the damage was already done. Over the next week, the tissue on the left side of her face began to slough away, simply dying and falling off in pieces as the venom's enzymes completed their terrible work. She lost her left eye completely. The infection that set in from the dead tissue required massive doses of antibiotics and 3 surgical debridements, where doctors literally carved away the necrotic flesh. Priya survived, but the left side of her face is now a landscape of scar tissue and skin grafts, permanently disfigured by a snake smaller than her forearm. The saw-scaled viper represents the absolute worst-case scenario in snake envenomation, a perfect storm of tissue destruction, hemorrhage, pain, and widespread availability. These snakes live where people live. They are active at night when people are sleeping or walking without light, and their venom is specifically evolved to cause massive hemorrhaging in prey much larger than themselves. The pain is described by bite victims as searing, relentless, and all-consuming. But worse than the pain is watching your body betray you as blood pours from wounds that refuse to close, as tissue turns black and dies, as organs begin failing from the toxins flooding your system. These top 3, the Russell's viper with its multi-system assault, the Ferdolence with its tissue-liquefying horror, and the saw-scaled viper with its combination of ubiquity and devastation, represent the absolute pinnacle of what snake venom can do to a human body. But knowing which bites are the worst is only part of the story. Understanding why these snakes evolved such excessive, such seemingly cruel weapons, and what happens to the survivors in the days, months, and years after the fangs withdraw, that's where the true depth of this nightmare reveals itself. The saw-scaled viper's position at number 1 isn't just about the potency of its venom or the severity of a single bite. It's about the sheer scale of human suffering this snake inflicts year after year, decade after decade, in some of the poorest and most medically underserved regions on Earth. While cobras and mudbutts capture headlines and fuel nightmares, the saw-scaled viper quietly kills more people than any other snake, and it does so in villages where antivenom might be 3 hours away by ox, where a single vial costs more than a month's wages, where traditional healers are often the first and only response to The World Health Organization estimates that saw-scaled vipers are responsible for more human deaths annually than all other snake species combined in their range. That's not dozens, that's thousands, every single year. And the deaths are not quick. They are prolonged, agonizing deteriorations as the victim bleeds internally, externally, as their organs fail one by one, as they remain conscious and aware that they are dying and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 2003, herpetologist Dr. Romulus Whitaker conducted extensive field research on saw-scaled viper bites in rural Rajasthan, documenting case after case that revealed the true horror of these encounters. He interviewed a farmer named Rajesh Kumar who had been bitten on the hand while reaching into a woodpile. Kumar described the first 30 minutes as manageable pain, severe but bearable, like a bad burn. But then the venom's full effects began to manifest. His hand didn't just swell, it transformed into something unrecognizable, bloating to the size of a small melon. The skin stretched so tight it became translucent, revealing the dark blood pooling beneath. The pain escalated from burning to something he described as being crushed and electrocuted simultaneously. Every heartbeat sent a fresh wave of agony up his arm. But worse was the bleeding. Blood began oozing from his gums without any wound present. His eyes filled with blood, blurring his vision. When he urinated, it was pure red. The anticoagulants in saw-scaled viper venom are so powerful they disable nearly every clotting mechanism in the human body. Your blood becomes as thin as water, seeping through vessel walls, pouring from any existing wound, and creating new hemorrhages throughout your internal organs. Kumar was fortunate. He reached a hospital within 2 hours and received but the tissue damage to his hand was so severe that 3 fingers had to be amputated. The venom had destroyed the blood vessels so completely that the fingers simply died from lack of circulation, turning black and mummified while still attached to his body. What makes the saw-scaled viper's venom particularly insidious is its composition varies by geographic location. The Echis carinatus found in India has slightly different venom proteins than the Echis ocellatus found in West Africa, which means antivenom produced for one population may be only partially effective against another. This has created situations where bite victims receive antivenom and still die because the antibodies in that particular antivenom don't neutralize all the toxins in that particular snake's venom. In 2011, a British herpetologist named David Worrell published research on saw-scaled viper bites in Nigeria that documented this phenomenon with chilling clarity. He followed 12 cases where victims received what should have been adequate antivenom within 3 hours of the bite. 4 of them died anyway. Their deaths were slow catastrophes. Blood continued pouring from their bite wounds, from their gums, from their intestinal tracts. Their kidneys shut down, unable to filter the massive amount of cellular debris created by the venom's destruction of red blood cells. They slipped into shock as their blood pressure dropped to unsustainable levels, and through it all, they remained conscious, aware, able to see their family members watching, helplessly as the venom completed its terrible work despite the antivenom coursing through their veins. The psychological trauma of saw-scaled viper bites extends far beyond the physical damage. Survivors develop what medical literature calls post-envenomation stress disorder, a condition remarkably similar to PTSD experienced by combat veterans. In 2016, researchers in Sri Lanka conducted long-term follow-up studies on saw-scaled viper bite survivors and found that nearly 70% experienced severe anxiety, insomnia, and flashbacks even years after the incident. Many reported they could no longer sleep on the ground, could no longer walk after dark, could no longer reach into any confined space without experiencing panic attacks. One survivor, a woman named Kumari who was bitten while cooking in her outdoor kitchen, described seeing snakes everywhere for months after the bite, in shadows, in ropes, in the patterns of fabric. Her brain had been so traumatized by the encounter that it began generating false positives constantly, flooding her with adrenaline dozens of times per day as her nervous system screamed warnings about threats that didn't exist. She eventually abandoned her village entirely, moving to a city apartment on the 3rd floor because she couldn't psychologically tolerate living anywhere a snake might possibly reach. The economic impact of saw-scaled viper bites in developing countries is staggering and rarely discussed. A farmer bitten during harvest season may lose not only months of work during recovery but potentially permanent function in the affected limb. In subsistence farming communities, this can mean the difference between a family eating or starving. The cost of antivenom alone can bankrupt entire extended families. In India, a complete course of saw-scaled viper antivenom requires an average of 15 to 20 vials, with each vial costing between $15 and $30 in regions where the average daily wage is less than $5. Families sell livestock, borrow money at predatory interest rates, sometimes sell their land, their only real asset, to pay for treatment, and even after surviving the bite, many victims face additional surgeries, skin grafts, amputations, and long-term complications like chronic kidney disease that require ongoing medical care they cannot afford. The saw-scaled viper doesn't just kill individuals, it impoverishes families for generations. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of saw-scaled viper envenomation is how it affects children. Because these snakes are small and often hunt at ground level, children playing outside or sleeping on floors are disproportionately represented in bite statistics. And because a child's body mass is much smaller than an adult's, the same venom load that might cause severe injury in an adult can be rapidly lethal in a child. In 2009, a medical team in Pakistan documented the case of a 5-year-old boy who was bitten on the ankle while playing in his yard. The venom-to-body mass ratio was catastrophic. Within 90 minutes, he was hemorrhaging from every mucous membrane. His brain began bleeding, causing seizures and loss of consciousness. Despite receiving antivenom, blood transfusions, and intensive care, he died 16 hours after the bite. The autopsy revealed bleeding in his brain, his lungs, his liver, his kidneys, and his intestines. The venom had essentially caused his entire vascular system to fail simultaneously. The doctors wrote in their report that the quantity of venom this small snake had injected would have been survivable in an adult, but in a child's small body, the concentration was simply too high for any intervention to reverse the cascade of destruction. The saw-scaled viper has evolved to be a perfect killing machine in the exact environments where humans are most vulnerable. It's small enough to hide anywhere, aggressive enough to stand its ground rather than flee, active at night when humans are sleeping or moving without adequate light, and equipped with venom specifically designed to cause catastrophic hemorrhaging in mammals much larger than the prey it normally hunts. Evolution doesn't design weapons to be cruel. It designs them to be effective. But effectiveness, when applied to human flesh, when witnessed in emergency rooms and village homes and field hospitals, looks exactly like cruelty. It looks like a 13-year-old girl losing half her face. It looks like a farmer bleeding from his eyes. It looks like a mother watching her child seize and hemorrhage and die despite every medical intervention available. The saw-scaled viper is the worst because it combines lethal venom with opportunity, existing in the exact places where humans live, work, and sleep, creating an endless stream of encounters that too often end in agony, disfigurement, or death. The aftermath of surviving the world's worst snake bites extends far beyond the initial hospital stay. Far beyond the moment when doctors declare the crisis averted and the antivenom successful, what survivors face in the months and years that follow is a landscape of chronic pain, permanent disability, psychological trauma, and in many cases, a complete restructuring of their lives around the reality that they will never fully recover from what happened when those fangs broke their skin. Medical literature is filled with case studies that follow bite victims for 5, 10, even 20 years post-event, and the findings paint a disturbing picture of how deeply snake venom can alter a human body on a permanent basis. Chronic kidney disease is perhaps the most common long-term complication of severe snake infection, particularly from vipers like the Russell's viper and saw-scaled viper, whose venom causes massive hemolysis and myolysis, the breakdown of red blood cells and muscle tissue. When cells are destroyed on this scale, they release their contents into the bloodstream, and the kidneys must filter these toxins. But the sheer volume overwhelms the kidney's capacity, and the myoglobin from destroyed muscle tissue is directly toxic to kidney cells. Even with early dialysis, many survivors develop chronic kidney failure that requires ongoing dialysis for the rest of their lives. In developing countries where dialysis access is limited and expensive, this often becomes a death sentence delivered in slow motion. A farmer in Myanmar who survived a Russell's viper bite in 2010 was tracked by medical researchers for 8 years afterward. His kidneys functioned at only 30% capacity, and he required dialysis twice per week. The cost consumed virtually all his income. He could no longer work his fields. His family fell into poverty. In 2018, he stopped dialysis treatments because he could no longer afford them. He died 6 weeks later from arimic poisoning as his damaged kidneys finally gave out completely. The snake hadn't killed him in 2010, but it had set in motion a cascade of organ failure that merely took 8 years to complete its work. Permanent tissue damage and amputation are the visible scars that snakebite survivors carry. The cytotoxic and proteolytic venoms of snakes, like the paralyzes, Gaboon Viper and saw-scaled viper, don't just cause temporary swelling. They destroy muscle tissue, tendons, ligaments, and nerves in ways that cannot regenerate. A construction worker in Colombia lost his entire calf muscle to paralyzes venom in 2005. The muscle was surgically removed because the necrotic tissue was becoming septic and threatening to kill him through systemic infection. He survived, but his leg is now little more than skin stretched over bone. He cannot run, cannot jump, cannot squat or climb. He walks with a severe limp and constant pain because the remaining muscles must work 3 times as hard to compensate for what was carved away. He was 42 when he was bitten. He's now in his 60s, and orthopedic specialists have told him his remaining leg muscles and joints are deteriorating rapidly from the unnatural stress, and he will likely require a wheelchair within the next decade. The snake took his calf in 2005, but it's slowly taking his mobility entirely, joint by joint, year by year. Neuropathic pain is perhaps the most psychologically devastating long-term effect because it cannot be seen, cannot be measured objectively, and often cannot be adequately treated. When venom destroys nerve tissue or causes severe inflammation around nerves, the damaged nerves can begin firing pain signals randomly and continuously. Survivors describe it as burning, stabbing, electric shocks that occur without warning dozens or hundreds of times per day. Standard pain medications are largely ineffective against neuropathic pain. Some survivors become dependent on opioids just to function, creating a secondary crisis of addiction. Others simply suffer in silence because the medical systems in their countries don't acknowledge or treat chronic pain adequately. A teacher in India who survived a viper bite in 2008 described her ongoing neuropathic pain as living with my hand in a fire that never goes out. The damaged nerves in her hand send constant pain signals to her brain. She cannot write on a chalkboard for more than a few minutes without the pain becoming unbearable. She cannot hold a cup of tea. She cannot button her clothes. She has tried every available treatment: nerve blocks, medication, physical therapy, even experimental stem cell treatments, and nothing provides more than temporary, partial relief. She told researchers she sometimes wishes they had simply amputated her hand after the bite because at least then the pain would have ended instead of becoming a permanent companion that colors every moment of every day for the rest of her life. The evolutionary purpose behind such devastating venom is straightforward. Snakes evolve these chemical weapons to subdue prey quickly and efficiently. A fertilance hunting a rat needs venom that will incapacitate that rat within seconds or minutes, preventing it from escaping into a burrow where the snake cannot follow. A saw-scaled viper taking down a bird needs venom that causes immediate cardiovascular collapse, But evolution is blind to suffering. It optimizes for effectiveness without any consideration for the agony that effectiveness creates. The venom that quickly kills a rat will, when applied to a much larger human, take hours or days to complete its work, and every hour of that process involves pain that the human nervous system is ill-equipped to process. We evolved pain as a warning signal, a way to avoid damage. But envenomation creates pain that serves no protective purpose, pain that cannot be avoided or reduced through behavioral changes, pain that simply exists as a byproduct of chemical warfare designed for creatures a fraction of our size. Recent research into venom composition has revealed something even more disturbing. These venoms are still evolving, and in some populations, they appear to be becoming more potent. A 2019 study of saw-scaled vipers in India found that venom from snakes living in agricultural areas had slightly different protein compositions than venom from snakes in less developed regions, and the agricultural area venom showed increased hemotoxic activity. The hypothesis is that these snakes are experiencing different selective pressures based on their prey. Agricultural areas have larger rats feeding on grain stores, and snakes that can take down larger prey more quickly have a survival advantage. This means the venom that is already the most medically significant in the world may be actively evolving to become even more destructive. In 50 years, in 100 years, the saw-scaled viper venom that causes so much human suffering today may be even more potent, even more difficult to treat, even more lethal. There are no true sanctuaries from these snakes. The saw-scaled viper's range extends across North Africa, through the Middle East, across the Indian subcontinent, a territory inhabited by billions of people. Climate change is expanding the ranges of many snake species as warming temperatures make previously inhospitable areas suitable for reptile life. Deforestation and agricultural expansion bring humans into closer contact with snake habitats. The World Health Organization has classified snakebite as a neglected tropical disease, recognizing that it kills more people annually than dengue fever, yet receives a fraction of the research funding and public health attention. The future holds not fewer snake bites but more, not better treatments in many regions but continued reliance on anti-venom that may not be available or affordable, not decreased suffering but an expanding crisis that affects the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations. The worst snake bites in the world are worst, not just because of the pain they cause in the moment of not just because of the grotesque swelling and bleeding and tissue death, but because they create ripples of suffering that extend outward through time and across communities. A single saw-scaled viper bite can destroy a life, impoverish a family, traumatize witnesses, and add one more story to the collective fear that shapes how millions of people interact with the natural world. These snakes are not evil. They are not cruel. They are simply what evolution produced in response to specific survival pressures, but the result of their existence, the consequence of their venom meeting human flesh, is a form of suffering so profound and so widespread that it ranks among the most significant causes of human agony on the planet. And every night, in villages across Africa and Asia, people go to sleep on floors and in fields, and in the darkness, the saw-scaled vipers are hunting, coiling, waiting with the infinite patience of a species that has perfected the art of the ambush over millions of years. The fangs are ready. The venom is loaded, and somewhere tonight, someone will step in the wrong place, reach into the wrong shadow, and discover exactly what the worst snakebite in the world actually feels like. But what if I told you there's something even worse waiting in the shadows, something that makes these bites feel like a paper cut? Click the video on screen right now. The most venomous creatures on Earth that can kill you in minutes,